were the second graduating class of officers who graduated from military academies. The first graduation took place in 1935. Remembering the intense days of study at the academy, exceptional workload and increased demands on us, I will allow myself in this book to stop the reader's attention on a very complex and responsible issue, on the preparedness of the Soviet Union and its army to repulse Hitler's invasion in 1941. Different and contradictory opinions are expressed. Historians and military specialists all over the world have written a lot on this issue. Many Soviet state and military leaders of that time are consciously or unwittingly accused of failures of the initial period of the war and the misfortunes that fell on the Soviet people. Undoubtedly, historians will continue to address this issue and find more and more new evidence to support these or those conclusions. For me, an officer and commander of the Soviet Army, who has passed together with it almost all the stages of its development and strengthening, this question has one answer. It is that the young Soviet power, rising from the ashes of the robbed and ruined Tsarist Russia, did not have enough time before the fateful day of June 22nd, 1941, to prepare for a different development of military operations on the Eastern Front in the initial period. A year or two before the outbreak of war, the army had already begun to receive in service new, more advanced weapons and combat equipment. As is known, these weapons and military equipment withstood the tests of the war and surpassed similar German samples. However, in 1940 to 1941, the Soviet army had a small number of such samples, and a number of new systems had not yet been tested. I do not exclude the role of such important factors as treachery and surprise, certain shortcomings in the organization of the army, some underestimation of the military strategic and operational sides in preparation for war, insufficient work with personnel. However, all of them, as well as many others, were of subordinate importance in comparison with the main factor, the lack of time to prepare for this, not yet seen in world history test of moral and material forces of the entire nation. And international imperialism was in a hurry. It well understood that time was not working for it, but for socialism, represented at that time by the only country, the Soviet Union. International imperialism could not but see how every day the young Soviet country was becoming stronger and stronger, and therefore it was in a hurry and made diabolical efforts to oppose the Soviet Union to the entire capitalist world. How was the Soviet people able to compensate for the lack of time and prepare a different development of the war already from June 22nd, 1941? How was it able to accumulate the necessary material forces to turn the course of hostilities and ensure victory?
Such a feat of an entire nation has never before been known to history. Its moral and physical sources are rooted in the nature of the social order, in the social class essence of socialism. Conscious of their historical mission before the peoples of the whole world, before world civilization and progress, Soviet workers, collective farmers and intellectuals spared neither effort nor time in order to provide the army with the necessary weapons and military equipment. All the people worked 16 to 18 hours a day under war conditions, with meager food, in unheated rooms, without necessary clothing. And it was not a day or two but years to make up for what was lacking at the beginning of the war. In defense of their fatherland, the Soviet people waged a war revolutionary in its essence. All mental and physical forces of the people were mobilized. This mobilization of forces was carried out voluntarily, consciously and willingly. Thanks to this, the miracle occurred, which many crowned and uncrowned scientists of the West will long marvel at. Of course, the comprehensive organization of this gigantic process, this great turning point, was led by the tried and tested Leninist Party, whose word was law for communists and non-party, men and women, children and old people in the struggle for the great and sacred cause of defending the fatherland. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union epitomized the unity, power and invincibility of the people. It made the impossible real. Guided by the Marxist-Leninist doctrine, it realized the great ideas of communism.
From the very first days of the existence of the Soviet Republic, the Soviet government and the Communist Party tirelessly took care of the armed forces of the country, knowing that sooner or later international imperialism would make a new attempt to destroy militarily the beacon of world communism, the world's first socialist state. The activities of the CPSU and all organs of Soviet power were subordinated to the solution of this general task. Along with all the special types of training that the military academies of the Soviet Union gave to their students, what was extremely valuable, in my opinion, was the fact that their educational and training programs were based on dialectical materialism, equipping the command and political cadres of the Soviet army with a creative, not dogmatic approach to the complex problems of military science and military art. New in its essence and purpose, the Soviet army had no one to draw experience and knowledge from. It had to pave its own way in the theory and practice of organizing the armed defense of its country. Here again it should be noted that in addition to all economic, political, military, technical, and other factors that provided a radical change in the fight against the superior enemy at the beginning of the war and prepared the victory on May 9, 1945, not the least role was played by the creative approach of command personnel of all levels to the management of combat operations during the war. Such an approach opened the space for thought and creative imagination, helped military commanders, especially in the highest levels, to analyze in depth the changing situation, to draw the right conclusions from the just conducted army or front operations, to stun the enemy not known until then decisions and actions, to impose their will and ultimately achieve victory. Tracing the history of the Great Patriotic War today, we are faced with such a peculiarity of it. Each operation conducted by the Soviet army at the fronts was different from the previous ones. Each operation was new and different in its conception and execution, and almost always caught the enemy by surprise in time, in the direction of the main blow, in the use of type of troops and weapons, and in the methods of action of units and formations. Soviet military commanders and commanders, creatively using Marxist-Leninist philosophy and the method of dialectical materialism, created a new, most advanced military science, Soviet military doctrine, Soviet operational art and tactics. Soviet military science withstood a huge test during the Great Patriotic War of 1941 to 1945 and put forward such outstanding commanders as marshals of the Soviet Union Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky, Govorov, and many other military leaders who wrote a heroic page in the history of the Soviet state, whose exploits will be admired by future generations.
The highest military commanders and commanders of all degrees gave any orders and instructions only after a comprehensive and creative study of them. After each operation, they analyzed in detail the reasons for successes and failures, the peculiarities of the actions of the performers, ways of countering the enemy, the nature of the terrain. Soviet commanders drew conclusions and stated their considerations without concealing earlier mistakes in their decisions and actions, and strictly within a certain period of time sent reports to higher headquarters.
Thus, on the basis of solid training received in military and civilian educational institutions, and in the course of practical activity in the most diverse and complex situation, Soviet military cadres were constantly growing, improving their professional skills, and becoming qualified armed defenders of the socialist homeland. Before the war, the party nominated capable, talented, honest commanders and military leaders to responsible positions, entrusted them with the fulfillment of tasks that determined the fate of events.
From my command practice in the Soviet army, especially during the Great Patriotic War, I know that we were taught to approach any issue creatively, with a sense of high responsibility, relying on the collective mind and experience of their subordinates, and we coped with seemingly impossible tasks.
Specialists in peacetime believed that it was impossible to build a bridge over the rotten Sivash, but during the war our two brigades built such a bridge, over which tanks passed, in just 20 days, and this under the direct impact of enemy aviation and artillery fire. The construction of the bridge stunned Hitlerites and misled them about the direction of the main blow of the 4th Ukrainian Front during the Crimean offensive operation. After graduating from the academy, I received the rank of captain and was appointed Chief of Staff of a separate sapper battalion of the 70th Motorized Rifle Division. The permanent deployment of the battalion was in the city of Penza, but the battalion was north of Leningrad, on the Karelian Isthmus, and was engaged in border fortification.
The defense construction on the Finnish border was due to the intensification of the anti-Soviet policy of the reactionary Finnish government.
Encouraged by international imperialism, Finland turned into an outpost of world reaction, and, as is well known, the imperialists managed later to provoke the Soviet-Finnish conflict. With the help of mainly German imperialism, a deeply echeloned Mannerheim line was built on Finnish territory, which became a serious support for the Finnish army and imperialism used it to reconnoiter the strength and fighting ability of the Soviet army. Although it was not a major strategic direction for the Soviet Union in the event of a possible war, the Soviet government could not ignore it. Being in the position of Chief of Staff of a separate sapper battalion, I could see with what tension and in how short a time the defence construction was to be carried out. Here, for the first time, I realised what thorough knowledge and training the academy gave us.
We created advanced positions of the fortified area and worked on a wide front. We built bunkers, caponiers, half-caponiers and dugouts. On a horse with a bustle in my hand, I moved from one construction site to another and checked the correctness of construction and technical fulfillment of projects. In the middle of November, I was summoned to Moscow. I had to go as a specialist to help Republican Spain.
In Moscow, I appeared in a special department of the People's Commissariat of Defence, where I was to receive a new appointment in the service. I met my comrades briefly, but the preparation for the trip and the special assignment lasted about a month. The departure had to remain a secret even for my family. I was preparing for the worst. The international moral and material aid to Republican Spain was no secret to the capitalist press and political circles of Europe and the world. The Soviet Union and the Soviet Army, like other proletarian international forces, could not advertise this aid and had to realize it in a roundabout, almost secret way. This was also due to the heterogeneous composition of the Spanish Republican government, formed on a broad democratic basis from representatives of various anti-fascist parties and organizations. And yet the most stable and consistent nucleus in it were the representatives of the Communist Party of Spain. I travelled from Moscow to Leningrad on the Red Arrow. Together with me in the compartment was an elderly man from a special department of the People's Commissariat of Defence. He, as if sharing his personal experiences, gave me some valuable advice on how to behave abroad in the most difficult situations and when meeting different people. Listening to my travelling companion, I once again felt the warm hand and paternal care of my superiors and comrades.
In the last days of December 1936, with a passport in the name of a Czech, I arrived in Finland. Then Sweden, Denmark. From Copenhagen I flew by airplane to Paris. The Republican government had a representative office there.
There was an incident at Paris airport. After filling out the appropriate forms, I was on my way to the exit when I was called.
Monsieur, come back. Your documents are not in order.
I returned to the customs official, trying not to show my anxiety. You didn't give your exact address where you lived in the Czech Republic, the official explained.
What can I do if I have never been to this country? The slightest inaccuracy could arouse suspicion. And then it hit me. The president of Czechoslovakia at the time was Masaryk. There can't be no street named after him, I thought. And indeed, all turned out well.
It was the last days of 1936. I went at once to the Spanish mission and declared that I was a volunteer and asked for assistance to leave for Valencia as soon as possible. I was surprised at the distrust with which the official met me. Later I learned that under the guise of volunteers various provocateurs were coming to the representative office, and that the activities of the representative office were relentlessly monitored by unfriendly French authorities. The New Year's Eve situation created additional difficulties. Busy with preparations for New Year's celebrations, many officials were often absent from their workplaces. After several days of wandering and explaining, I turned to the Soviet embassy for assistance. The military attaché, Comrade Vasilchenko, helped me in this confusing situation. On January 4th, 1937, I left Paris with a new passport and arrived safely in Republican Spain the next day.
In Valencia, I went to the chief councillor Jan Karlovich Berzin. From him I was to receive instructions on the work to be done, as stipulated by the order from Moscow. Jan Karlovich Berzin, broad-shouldered, with an oblong face, blue eyes and thick grey hair, welcomed me as a man whom I had long expected.
The fighting is mainly in and around Madrid. There, the Central Front, said J.K. Berzin. You are the first officer from the engineering forces of the Soviet Army. Your help is especially needed there now. Report to the Chief of Engineers at the General Staff. Try not to delay and leave for Madrid as soon as possible. The situation there is very tense. Chief of Engineers, a colonel of the old army, was over 60. Familiar with the situation at the fronts, he talked more about what he personally thinks to do than about what has been done or is being done. It was felt that the old colonel did not know the situation. He approved of my desire to go to the Madrid front, saying that it would be a very good thing, because the main fighting was going on there, and that he himself would gladly go to Madrid if it were not for the work that was so plentiful in Valencia. He did not fail to add that it was very dangerous there now, and advised me to go at night. On the night of January 7th, I set out for Madrid, the stronghold of the Republican Army. The car was travelling at breakneck speed. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep. At dawn I was awakened by some chaotic rumbling machine guns, rifles, mortars, loud gun salves. "This is Madrid," said the chauffeur.
It was January 7th, 1937. On the deserted streets of the city in some places fires were burning, around which the workers were warming themselves.
On January 3rd, the interventionists and the Frankists launched their second offensive against Madrid, striking the main blow in the direction of El Pardo, a suburb of Madrid, bypassing the city from the northwest. They sought to seize the capital of the Republic. The front line was in the area of the villages of Las Rosas and Umira, and in the southeast in the city itself through the University City, the Park Casa de Campo, and the French Bridge. On the day of my arrival, fierce fighting was going on in the Las Rosas section and in University City with varying success. The first Republican units created by the Spanish Communist Party fought hard and with dedication. They had already tested their strength and accumulated experience, reflecting the first rebel offensive in November 1936. The Western press trumpeted the imminent fall of Madrid. The Frankists were preparing to enter the city in triumph, and the white horse on which Franco was going to parade in Madrid probably stood saddled in one of the rural stables of Arawak or Carabanchel Bajo. Unfortunately, it was not only the rebels and interventionists who were eager for the imminent fall of Madrid, but also many of the leaders of the Madrid front, such as, for example, Prime Minister Largo Caballero. Even during the first fascist offensive, in the fall of 1936, he evacuated the Republican government to Valencia. This was a stab in the back to the Madrid workers, a stab in the back to the fighters of the 5th Regiment, a regiment of communists and fighters of the International Brigades of Madrid. The workers and fighters of the interbrigades, led by the Communist Party, fought bravely and selflessly, heroically defending every barricade, every house. With bayonets and blood they wrote no pasaran. The defenders of Madrid inflicted heavy losses on the enemy. They managed to stop the offensive, and in some parts of the front, to throw the enemy back to the original positions. Behind the back of the defenders of Madrid streets adjacent to the front line were blocked by strong barricades of granite cobblestones. For defence, the Republicans adapted many of the houses. Nests for machine guns and hand-held machine guns were built in them, and embrasures were punched in the walls. Windows were covered with sandbags. In the courtyards between the houses, passages of communication were dug. These, although hastily created, defensive structures significantly increased the stability of the defence and allowed to conduct effective fire on the advancing, armed-to-the-teeth Nazi legions. They contributed to the successful repulsion of both the first and second offensive against Madrid. The construction of barricades and fortifications in Madrid began at the end of October 1936, when, under the leadership of the Communist Party, the workers of the city, all as one, rose to defend their capital. The workers knew that barricades were necessary and built them very quickly, despite the fact that there were no military specialists among them to build shelters to protect them from artillery shells. In addition, both in the formation of the Republican military units and in the construction of the defences and barricades in Madrid, the Communist Party had to overcome the sabotage of some of the old officers who remained in the Republican Army. The party also had to fight the defeatist policies of Prime Minister Largo Caballero and the right-wing socialist Prieto, as well as the treachery of anarchists and other enemies of the people. Largo Caballero and Prieto believed that the brave Republican Army did not need to build defensive positions, that it was humiliating for it to be entrenched and buried in the ground. This harmful theory was propagated and carried out in the units by the old officers.
At the front headquarters, which was located in the building of the Ministry of War, I appeared before the advisor to the front commander, Kombrig Gorev, former military attaché of the USSR in Republican Spain. General Gorev, a tall, slender man with grey hair, familiarized me with the situation in detail, emphasizing that the situation in the city is very difficult and that the fiercest fighting is taking place in the areas of the French Bridge, the Parc Casa de Campo and University City.
Go tomorrow. First of all to the area of the French Bridge, and then familiarize yourself with other parts of the front. Help your Spanish comrades and show them how to fortify their positions. They are building and have already built something, but it's all very primitive. The Spanish comrades have no cadre sappers. They have no experience and do not know how to use the natural conditions of the terrain to strengthen their defences, said General Gorev. Then he introduced me to the officers with whom I was to work. Remember, you are not to command. Do so that your recommendations and advice are perceived, but do not command, advised General Gorev, and we parted. For the first time I inspected the forward positions on the morning of January 8, 1937. When we got into the car with the interpreter, both of us in civilian clothes, a lieutenant sat next to the driver. He explained that he had been assigned to accompany me. As we started off, motorcycles rumbled to our right and left and lined up in a wedge in front of the car. I asked what kind of motorcyclists they were. The lieutenant replied that they were guards, and added, "That's the order." An order is an order, but with such an escort could not get closer to the front line, and by the nature of my work I should have been at the most advanced points of the fighting order. In the area of the French Bridge was to inspect the positions and their engineering equipment. The leading edge of this section of the front ran along the Manzanares River. The Republicans occupied the left bank of the river, and the Frankists the right bank of the river. The Republicans had no equipped positions. The fighters were located in the outermost houses, closest to the river, and from the windows fired at the enemy. Primitive positions were made only for machine guns. Stone buildings with embrasures, board fences and other piles in yards were used as shelters. In open areas and gardens, the soldiers took shelter behind trees, behind small bunkers made of stones. There were no trenches and communication lines in the front line of the defence, although the battles were fought here for a long time, and all this could have been dug in the course of the fighting. However, the Republican infantrymen had no tools. Many of the streets facing the river were blocked by barricades, hastily built of stones, cobblestones and stone slabs taken from the sidewalks and sidewalks. Later, the fortification of Madrid engaged formed engineering and construction, or, as they were called, fortification battalions, which by May 1937 created a slender system of deeply echeloned defensive positions. On the third day, that is, January 9th, I introduced myself to the Chief of Engineers of the Madrid front, Colonel Ardid. I was met by an elderly man with a military bearing and a serious expression on his face. He already knew about my visit to the positions. As Ardid himself explained to me, the lieutenant who accompanied me was his son and served under him as a commissioned officer. His other son was his adjutant. A career officer in the Spanish army, Colonel Ardid remained loyal to the Republican government to the end of his life. Unlike his superior from Valencia, Colonel Ardid had a good understanding of the situation at the front and excelled in combat engineering. He informed me that 2 fortification battalions were ready and 3 more were being formed, and that a mine was being dug in the University City to blow up the hospital building, which the Nazis had turned into a heavily fortified stronghold. He asked me to visit the site and check how properly the work was being done there. It was very convenient for me, as I already knew about this object and had an order from General Gorev to take care of it. Referring now to the request of the Chief of Engineering troops of the front, I could more easily explain my visit to the commanders who carried out this digging. The object was in the section of a rifle brigade commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Martinez Aragon, a career officer of about 45 years of age. I reported to him that I had come on behalf of Colonel Ardid to familiarize myself with the progress of the mine-bombing operations and to assist if necessary. When the interpreter began to translate my words, the lieutenant colonel became nervous and his face reddened, and when he answered something, the paint flooded the face of my interpreter, the Spaniard Trillier. Very embarrassed, Trillier, who had a rather poor command of Russian, translated to me roughly the following words of the lieutenant colonel. "I am a career officer. I served and fought in Morocco, and I don't need any help." I realized that I had hurt my ego, and I hurried to correct the situation immediately. I asked to translate that my main task is to study their experience, not to teach them. The lieutenant colonel immediately changed his tone and kindly invited me to inspect the undercut. There were 2 mine galleries. One, 125 meters long, was ready and loaded in the other gallery, about 85 meters long. The work was being finished. Together with Lieutenant Colonel Aragon, we went to one of the forward observation posts, located in a house on Inlays Street.
Along this street passed the leading edge of the defence of the Republicans. The strongholds of the fascist defence were located in the buildings of the university campus. The newly built, but not yet finished 7-story building of the clinical hospital was one of the strongest, advanced forward strongholds of the enemy. The embrasures of machine gun points in many places were visible to the naked eye, as the distance to the building was about 250 meters.
After inspecting the front edge of the enemy's defence, we went underground by a narrow stone staircase. We stopped on a small platform. In all 4 directions, the sewer pipes of ellipsoidal cross-section departed from here. At each of the 4 corners were attached signs with the names of streets. We followed each other along one of these underground streets, which were as high as a man's height. After a while we reached a new crossroads and saw the inscription inlays. This meant that above us was the front edge of the Republican positions. Further we moved along a hastily dug gallery, above which the enemy's positions were located. About 50 to 60 meters from Inlays Street, the gallery turned to the right at a sharp angle. This was the 150-meter-long part of the gallery ready with the charges installed. All that was left was to connect the electrical cables, explained the technician who accompanied us. The left branch was shorter, about 85 meters. The earthwork was also completed here, and the explosive charge was placed, but not yet covered with soil on the gallery side.
I inspected the finished gallery and noted that the ground filling of the charge was technically incorrect. It was covered with only 2 or 3 rows of sandbags. With such packing, the force of the explosion would dissipate, the blast wave would travel along the line of least resistance down the long empty gallery and then through the sewer system. As a result, the blast effect would be minimized. I explained all this to the technician, told him what the charge should be and how to make it.
Lieutenant Colonel Martinez Aragon listened silently to our conversation with the technician, but on his face was written indignation. When we got to the surface, the lieutenant colonel suddenly shouted, "Where's my engineer? I'll shoot him."
After that meeting, LT. Cole, Aragon and I became best friends. He was looking for me through the front headquarters.
"Please send Major Dunajski to me. I need him very much." Aragon appealed to the advisor to the front commander, General Gorov. I inspected this object several more times. We went down with the engineer of the brigade into the underground galleries and checked the filling of the charge, which was now made very solid. Having checked everything thoroughly, we personally detonated the explosion at 6:30 on January 17th. The effect was enormous. Most of the 7-story hospital building went up in the air, along with the Nazis and their weapons. The fighters of Martinez Aragon's brigade, instead of attacking immediately, expressing their delight, began throwing hats into the air with shouts of "Long live the Republic, death to fascism, long live Russia." As a result, the Republican attack was late. This gave the fascists a chance to come to their senses, pull up reserves in the surviving part of the building, and regroup their forces. Martinez Aragon's brigade rushed into the attack half an hour late. A fierce battle ensued, which lasted into the evening.
After the explosion, the neighbouring brigades opened hurricane fire with all kinds of weapons on the enemy positions, but did not attack. Failing to receive support from their neighbours, Aragon's men abandoned the hospital building and returned to their original positions. Thus, the successful explosion of the fortified building, which destroyed most of the enemy's manpower along with weapons, and the panic that arose in the ranks of the fascists, were not used by the Republicans.
Thus, the most important stronghold in the university city remained in the hands of the fascists. But despite the failure of the first attempt, the Republicans developed a new plan of underground mine warfare in University City, and then in Carabanchel Bajo and other parts of the Madrid front.
The enemy took retaliatory measures. It should be noted that the Republicans had no devices or instruments to detect underground work. The Republicans received information about the installation of explosive charges by the fascists from defectors from the enemy camp. This information was not accurate, but despite this, the Republicans still managed to thwart the efforts of the insurgents before they reached the target.
Between January and May 1937, while Republican sappers were engaged in mine and countermine warfare in Madrid and its suburbs, the Spanish fascists and Italian-German interventionists undertook two more major offensive operations. After the January enemy offensive was suspended, the Corps units, whose commander was Colonel Prado, had to fortify themselves on the occupied lines. By order of the Chief of Staff of the front, Colonel Rojo, I went to check the work on the strengthening of positions and to assist, in this case, the Corps command. It was necessary to quickly erect defences, trenches and other fortifications, because the front command intended to withdraw to the reserve several strike formations, which during the Frankist offensive operated in the Corps' defence. At the headquarters of the Corps, housed in villas in the resort suburb of El Pardo, 5 kilometres northwest of Madrid, I was kindly met by Colonel Prado, a tall, slender 50-year-old officer with greying hair. He invited me to sit with him by a blazing fireplace in the back of a large hall, the walls of which were hung with antlers and boars' heads. I reported the purpose of my visit, expressing a desire to see the condition of the defences in place. The colonel ordered to bring coffee and began to explain in a long and tedious manner that there were no works on engineering strengthening of the positions in the units entrusted to him. "They are not needed," he said, and explained that the Spaniards were brave soldiers and would prefer to take shelter behind a wall or behind a tree, but would not demean themselves by digging and burying themselves in the ground. Incidentally, he expressed his displeasure that the front command had not authorized him to carry out an operation to regain the positions previously occupied, and asked me to help him to obtain such authorization. "Please see how strong and convenient the firing positions are," Prado said. "There are stone walls and many trees, and in the open areas you can dig trenches if the front headquarters sends us engineering units, because my soldiers will not be engaged in digging trenches."
I asked permission to inspect the positions with someone. Colonel Prado declared that he himself would go with me. It was getting dark when we approached the front, accompanied by a small guard. The colonel walked without ducking like a knight, without climbing into the trenches and communication passages made by the soldiers. I saw an uneven line of shallow trenches, the berms of which were not levelled and camouflaged. Climbing out of the cells and wrapped in their triangular blankets, the soldiers sat on the ground in groups of 2 or 3. Some were eating their supper, others, having finished their supper, were smoking, and still others were wiping their woks with dry grass. About 100 metres from the leading edge of the small hole, covered with plywood, the company commander, a lieutenant, came out of a small hole and reported to the colonel.
"Everything is in order. The enemy and we are not firing. The men are having supper."
Colonel Prado told the lieutenant that I was a Russian major and was interested in the trenches.
"The trenches are very bad. No tools. They found picks and shovels in the neighbouring houses, but only a few pieces," the lieutenant explained.
A group of 15 to 20 men gathered around us. Soon the battalion commander, a major, came up and was informed of our visit.
I drew the colonel's attention to the fact that the enemy could open fire on our group, which was increasing. The fighters recognized that the officer with the black beard was a Camarado Russo, and everyone wanted to look at him. "Nothing, now the enemy is having dinner, but in 25 minutes we'll start firing," said the major, and suggested that we go to his command post, located on the back slope, where trenches and dugouts were dug. It was explained to me that during lunch and dinner both sides do not fire. Still, I asked the major to order the soldiers to take their places so that the enemy would not take advantage of our arrival and launch an attack. The company commander showed me the trenches where the observers were. Indeed, 10 to 15 metres from the front line I saw trenches in which stood soldiers in full combat gear with weapons in their hands. The positions of the observers were connected with the front line of defence by deep narrow passages of communication. So I thought, the fighters know the value of trenches and passages after all. At the battalion command post, Colonel Prado did not go, referring to urgent matters. The battalion commander turned out to be a reserve officer, a teacher by profession, a communist. He did not share the colonel's view that fortifications were not necessary. We need them very much, but we don't have the means to build them. The men have no tools. Just yesterday, when repelling an attack, our men were digging up the ground with their hands and putting stones in front of them to escape machine gun fire. Many of our fighters have not served in the army, and now, during the fighting, they are learning to shoot and entrench. Cruel reality. The fighters of the Republican Army learned the art of fighting and entrenching in battle. No one taught them this, and there were no tools. In such a difficult situation, had to correctly address the issues of engineering support of combat operations. It was clear that the defense of Madrid is a protracted character. The action will continue for a long period, and this required the systematic creation of a solid defense with a branched system of trenches, communication lines, barricades, and long-term fire points. In addition, as a result of heavy rains, old barricades and trenches began to collapse. The tasks of strengthening the defences required the creation of engineer construction battalions. The builders of the first Madrid barricades, Madrid labourers, became the core of the first engineering and construction battalions. They began to be created in January-February 1937. They were to rebuild destroyed and build new barricades and fortifications. On the construction of Madrid barricades and fortifications were formed and trained fortification battalions of the Madrid, and then the entire central front. Simultaneously with the restoration and construction of new barricades on the front line began their construction and in the depth of the defence. The need to organise a deeply echeloned defence and ensure rapid manoeuvring caused the creation of a new type of barricades. If the old barricades completely blocked the streets, the new ones formed two wings, between which there was a free space of 2.5-3 metres wide for the passage of vehicles and troops. However, both types of barricades had the same disadvantages. They were built hastily. The rear side was without fences that would have protected the soldiers from mine and shell fragments that exploded behind the barricade. The first type of barricade completely suspended traffic on the streets, and the second made it very difficult. By the end of January, we had managed to eliminate these shortcomings, and a new third type of barricade, the tower barricade, appeared on the streets of Madrid. This type of barricade was built on the sidewalks on both sides of the streets parallel to the outer walls of high-rise buildings at a distance of 0.8 metres from them. Thus, a corridor was formed between the barricade and the wall of the building, which reliably protected the soldiers from small arms fire and shell fragments. Machine gun points were arranged in turrets at the corner of the street. Their embrasures were located so that the angle of fire was 180 degrees, which made it possible to fire in two directions.
In addition to the forward towers, additional towers were built depending on the need to create a denser fire along the barricade. For rifle fire, loopholes were made along the entire length of the barricade and in the towers themselves. The tower barricade was intended to solve one of the burning problems of the 1.5 million inhabitants of Madrid, not to interfere with street traffic and to allow free manoeuvring of military units. At the same time, numerous machine gun towers made it possible to conduct multi-level fire in all directions. At the same time, such barricades provided reliable protection from enemy fire. In combination with other types of barricades, numerous caponiers and other fortifications erected in streets, squares and squares and squares in combination with houses adapted for defence, this system turned the city into an impregnable fortress, which became the citadel of the Republican forces of Spain for almost 3 years.
After an unsuccessful attempt in January to seize Madrid, with a frontal attack, Italian-German interventionists and the Frankists immediately began preparations for a third major offensive on the citadel of the Republic. The enemy's plan was to strike the main Italian Expeditionary Corps from the area of Sigüenza in the direction of Guadalajara, Alcalá de Henares, and converging auxiliary strike by the forces of the Corps, Madrid, from the areas of Umanes, Illescas, Cecina in the direction of Arganda, to encircle and destroy the main forces of the Republican troops and seize Madrid. Fascist Corps Madrid, which had about 30,000 soldiers and reinforced by a significant amount of artillery, about 100 tanks and 70 aircraft, began the offensive on the Harama River on February 6, 1937. Overcoming the heroic resistance of the weak Republican units defending this section of the front, the Fascist Corps, taking advantage of the huge superiority in strength and despite heavy losses in the first days of the offensive, managed to capture a small bridgehead on the east bank of the Harama.
February offensive Frankist troops in the area of Jarama, just 25 kilometers south of Madrid, put in an extremely difficult situation the Republican command, and especially the command of the troops defending the Madrid front, as the enemy's success could adversely affect the defense of the capital. Madrid front did not have reserves that could be moved to threatened areas, and therefore had to maneuver troops engaged directly in the defense of the city. These were Lister's division and the International Brigades, heroically fought in January in University City, Casa de Campo, Las Rosas, and other sections of the Madrid front.
The Madrid command began to move these units rapidly into the Jarama area. The Republican forces were growing. For 10 days of fierce fighting, they managed to stop the enemy offensive and on February 17th began a counter-offensive that threw the fascists back to their original positions. Thus, on February 26th, the Karam operation was almost completely completed, and both sides again went on the defensive. During the Haram operation, the Republican troops, even after the transfer of reserves from the Madrid front, had to fight the enemy, significantly outnumbered and outgunned. The Republicans achieved rapid success mainly due to the fact that in this battle hardened in the January battles of the units, which already had a thorough combat experience, and in the ability to fight not inferior to the regular fascist units. Another important reason for the success should be considered the exceptionally high morale, patriotic spirit and readiness for self-sacrifice of the soldiers and commanders of all branches of the troops involved in the Battle of Karam. The high morale of the fighters of the Republican Army was their greatest advantage over the numerically superior enemy troops, equipped with first-class weapons and military equipment. To a large extent contributed to the success and accumulated experience of commanders in the January battles of maneuvering available forces, when the threatened areas immediately moved forces from relatively quiet areas of the front. In the conditions of Madrid, the distances between the areas of active fighting and calm sections of the front were small, and the transfer of strike units was relatively easy. However, during the Haram operation, the strike units withdrawn from the Madrid front had to be hurriedly transferred to the areas of combat operations at distances of 30 to 50 kilometers, and this required highly mobile vehicles. The use of a fairly dense railroad network near Madrid was out of the question, because it was destroyed in many places. The most convenient for this case branch Madrid-Aranjuez was under enemy artillery fire, and at the railroad station in Getafe rebels were even machine gun fire. Vehicles were needed, and the Madrid front, like the rest of the Republican Army, had no vehicles. In the headquarters of the front and in the general staff of the Republican Army did not think about this issue. The units and formations of the front had only a small number of vehicles, which could barely cope with the delivery of ammunition and food for the soldiers and the population of the defending city.
On February 6th, at the beginning of the enemy offensive, when the headquarters of the Madrid front was discussing which units and how to move to the Harama River area, the commander of the 12th International Brigade, General Lukács, stated that he could move the brigade with his own motor transport. This statement of General Lukács was not a surprise to me, and some of the staff of the Madrid front headquarters. During the January battles we used his transport several times to bring building materials needed for the construction of fortifications. Colonel Rojo, the chief of staff of the Madrid front, knew about the brigade's vehicles, and he was repeatedly informed that General Lukács's men were picking up wrecked and abandoned trucks and trying to repair them in their spare time.
And now the hard work of General Lukács' men was yielding results thanks to the availability of vehicles. It was possible to carry out rapid maneuvering. The success of the Haram operation was greatly contributed to the engineering troops. In this operation for the first time were organized activities that contained elements of engineering support of the battle. In the engineering support of the Haram operation participated 4 fortification battalions, each of which numbered from 800 to 1,000 men. The battalions were equipped with picks and shovels but no weapons. An additional 1,000 workers were mobilized from Madrid and its suburbs. Thus, the total number of engineer troops mobilized for the engineering support of the Haram operation was about 6,000 men. Almost all the fortification battalions were formed in Madrid in January and took part in the construction of barricades, trenches, and other defences on the Madrid front. In accordance with Spanish manuals and regulations, the first line of defensive positions was selected by the General Army commanders and equipped in engineering by their own engineer units, under the direction of the Chief of Engineering of the unit, or formation. The second line of defence and rear positions were equipped by the engineer chief in coordination with the general military commander. Of course, in the Haram operation, such a scheme could not be used. 3 fortification battalions out of 4 were attached to the divisions, and the battalion Madrid workers was entrusted with the erection of rear positions. In practice, the front line of the trenches was not determined by anyone. The workers of the fortification battalions came to the soldiers in the evening and began to dig trenches in the places where the soldiers were lying down, without being able to assess the convenience of the terrain for firing. Only where construction work was supervised by officers, technicians, or General Army officers who had known experience in selecting positions was trench work conducted competently from both technical and tactical points of view. The command staff of the fortification battalions was composed of civilian engineers and technicians who quickly mastered the technical features of military construction. But in tactical terms, their work was still far from perfect.
As a result of hard and persistent work of the personnel of the engineering units in the first 3 or 4 days of the operation, the entire section of the front from the Aragon Bridge on the Jarama River to Aranjuez was covered with trenches, and the most important areas covered in wire barriers. Naturally, the trenches dug under such conditions were not perfect. They did not have sharp turns, creating favourable conditions for firing in different directions, did not have underbrook shelters for soldiers and niches for ammunition.
The positions were predominantly linear in nature. The ground was hard, stony, and therefore the depth of the trenches in some places barely reached 50 centimetres, and to create conditions for firing standing up, stones were placed in front of the trench, and most often bags of earth or sand. Machine gun nests and observation posts were also equipped with sandbags or earth. And yet, despite the rather primitive equipment of the positions in terms of engineering, they helped the Republican troops not only to stop the advance of superior enemy forces, but also to repel his repeated attacks, and later served as starting positions for a counter-offensive.
On March 8, 1937, almost immediately after the end of the fighting at Haram, the fascists launched their last major offensive. From the area of Sigüenza on Guadalajara began to advance selected units of Italian, German interventionists and Spanish fascists, equipped with the most modern weapons and a large amount of military equipment. The main blow was dealt by the Italian Expeditionary Corps, which numbered about 50,000 soldiers and a large amount of military equipment: 220 guns, 108 tanks, 32 armoured cars, 1,600 machine guns and machine guns. Aviation was also involved.
The direction to Guadalajara covered only the 12th Republican Division, which had about 10,000 soldiers and a relatively small amount of equipment. Due to the fact that the division stretched along the front for 80 kilometres, it could not create a solid, deeply echeloned defence. This made it possible to many times superior in strength of the enemy in the first 2 days of fighting to break through its defences, and, despite the stubborn resistance of the Republican units to seize the city of Briega, located 90 kilometres northeast of Madrid. To the place of the breakthrough to strengthen the defence had to move new units. For this purpose was formed the 4th Army Corps under the command of Cadre Military Colonel Jurado. The Corps included the International Brigade and some other units and formations removed from the Haram section and taken from the reserve of the Madrid front. The plan was to move them to the new area of operations with the help of vehicles of the 12th International Brigade, now greatly augmented by trophy vehicles captured in the Haram operation. Units began to move quickly to the site of the breakthrough, and on the evening of March 9th, the International Brigade, unloaded from vehicles on the highway 10 kilometres west of Briega, began to deploy in combat order in the direction of the city. In the area of the highway Madrid-Zaragoza on a hill located 6 to 7 kilometres east of the city of Torilla and 8 to 9 kilometres from the newly occupied by the enemy city of Briega, moved the task force headquarters of the newly created 4th Corps together with the Corps commander to study the situation on the spot and prepare solutions for the upcoming battle. There were also commanders of some suitable units and formations included in the Corps, and a large group of internationalist volunteers who worked at the headquarters of the Madrid front and the General Staff. Among them were Councillor Petrovich, General of Tank Troops D.G. Pavlov, Lieutenant Colonel Ratner and others. We were on the front slopes of the hill. Here for 3 or 4 kilometres, on both sides of the highway, sappers and peasants from the surrounding villages dug trenches for approaching units.
I remember that everyone's attention was attracted by the groups of fighters coming from Brieux in a wide front.
They are soldiers of the retreating 12th Division, said Lieutenant Colonel Modesto, a prominent Spanish communist. Everyone must go to their units, ordered General Petrovich. The soldiers must be stopped at the line of trenches dug by the population. Let them occupy the defence. In an instant, the entire group of commanders headed towards the retreating soldiers. I met a large group of soldiers marching with the company commander. "Why are you retreating?" I asked them. "The enemy is advancing," answered the lieutenant, pointing in the direction of Brieux. "A lot of enemy forces?" I asked. Mucho. There are Italians, they have a lot of tanks. We need to stop the company and take the defence in this place. And I showed the area where the company should be positioned. You see, reinforcements are coming. At that time, the units of the International Brigade were approaching the top of the hill in battle order. Yes, my major, I see. Now we will move to the defence. Within an hour, the retreating units were halted and placed in defensive positions. The Corps commander with his group remained here to prepare for the upcoming battle and meeting approaching from the rear of the units, and the staff of the front headquarters dispersed to organise and accelerate the transfer of troops from Madrid to the area of combat operations. General Pavlov turned to me. "Comrade engineer, tomorrow our tanks will enter the battle. It is necessary to support the attack of tanks and infantry by aviation, but the weather is bad and the airfields have melted. Will you help the aviators so that they can take off in the morning?" "The task is difficult," I answered, and began to go over in my memory. What can be done to strengthen the scattered runways? Let's try compacting the runways with straw. Not only try, but do everything possible so that our aviation can take to the air, remarked General Petrovich, in whose presence this conversation was conducted. Go to Madrid and act through the head of the engineering forces of the front. I will also talk to Colonel Rojo tonight, so that he will provide you with the necessary assistance. Late in the evening arrived in Madrid. The head of engineering troops of the front, Colonel Ardida, found in his office. "I have no experience in this regard," he said, listening to me carefully. I told him about the needs of the front, the difficulties with the use of aviation, and outlined my thoughts on how to strengthen the runway in these conditions. At that time the telephone rang. It was Colonel Rojo calling. "Yes, I know," answered Colonel Ardid. "Major Dunarski is with me. I'm giving orders. We're running out of time. We may be late, but by noon the task will be accomplished." In the morning, the necessary straw was brought to Alcala Airfield and 2 other, more remote, airfields. The teams serving the airfields and the mobilized local population quickly spread a thin layer of straw on the runway and tamped it down with the wheels of horse-drawn carts, then spread another layer of straw and tamped it down again with carts, and then compacted it with rollers, which were usually used to compact arable land. Thus the runway at the Alcala airfield was ready by noon, and soon the first airplanes were in the air. The other 2 airfields were ready the next day by morning. On March 11th, all 3 airfields were already in operation, and the Republican fighters Chatos shot the columns of the Italian motorized division Littorio, passing along the narrow, deep defile of the river Tohonia. The enemy's aviation, however, was unable to take to the air on March 11th and 12 and support the offensive of his troops. After the capture of Brieux, the enemy continued the offensive, but the heroic resistance of parts of the 12th Republican Division and the 12th International Brigade of General Lukács quickly thwarted his impulse. March 10th, the enemy offensive was finally halted at a line 7 to 8 kilometers southwest of Brieux. Repeated attacks of the enemy met stubborn resistance of parts of the Fourth Corps, and March 12th, the enemy was forced to withdraw to the northeast. And on March 18th, the Republican troops launched a general counter-offensive. The fighting spirit and offensive impulse of the Republican troops was growing. I remember I asked the men of the 12th Republican Division, "Are the Italians strong?" No. They dropped their weapons, raised their hands and shouted camarado, but Tyra, when they were kicked in the teeth, they started calling us comrades. As a result of a decisive counter-offensive and unfolded over several days of heavy fighting, Italian fascist troops could not withstand and began to panic retreat. They were pursued by tanks and aviation. On March 22nd, the Italians were completely defeated. The Republicans captured many prisoners, especially from the motorized division Littorio, many weapons and almost all the combat equipment and vehicles of the Italian Corps. On March 22nd, having defeated and thrown back the enemy behind his original lines from which he began his offensive, we again went on the defensive and immediately began the organized construction of engineering fortifications in our positions. The leading edge of the main defensive strip this time was determined not depending on the advance of the enemy troops, but at the will of the command of the Republican troops, and passed along the most convenient for defense heights, located 35 kilometers east of Briuga. For engineering support of the Guadalajara operation from the Haram and other sections of the Madrid front were attracted 5 fortification battalions and 2 special companies for the device of barriers and the implementation of mine blasting. In the first days of the enemy offensive, from March 8 to 11, Republican engineering units prepared for destruction of 120 objects, including all bridges and part of the main roads, through which the enemy led the attack on Guadalajara, Sacedon, Cifuentes, Belenia, Humans. Many of the objects prepared for destruction, which fell into the enemy's offensive strip, were blown up, which significantly slowed his advance. A great role in the success of the operation was played by the timely reconnaissance of the bridge on the Tahuna River, near the village of Masigoso on the highway Torrio-Briega-Masigoso de Tahuna. It was blown up as the Italian motorized division Littorio was moving along the highway in the winding and narrow defile of the river. The Republicans slammed it here like a mousetrap and then defeated it by air. In the early days of the operation, most of the fortification battalions were used to equip the rear defensive line, and 1 battalion, assigned to engineer the battle for Lister's 11th Division, operated on the main line. During the Republican offensive, all of the fortification battalions were attached to the formations to support their advance, and after the transition to defense, on 22nd March, 4 battalions began to equip the main defensive line. 1 battalion was assigned to create a guard band, which was occupied by the covering units. Thanks to the accumulated experience, perseverance and selfless work of the soldiers of the fortification battalions, only for 4 days, from March 22nd to March 26th, a solid defense of 80 kilometers along the front was created with trenches for firing standing and with equipped firing positions for hand and machine guns. The works were carried out under the influence of artillery and, in many places, rifle and machine gun fire. The actions of engineering support units in the Guadalajara operation were more organized and made a major contribution to success. The actions of all branches of troops were characterized by greater coherence, and the General Army staffs learned to organize the defense and interaction between branches of troops more clearly. It should also be noted that in the course of this operation significantly increased morale and political spirit of units and formations, increased discipline and combat effectiveness, strengthened faith in the ultimate victory. The great success achieved in the Guadalajara operation contributed to the improvement of the combat effectiveness of the Republican troops on other fronts as well. After the successful battles of the Republican Army at Guadalajara, the Chief Counselor General Petrovich conducted a detailed review of the operation and combat operations. Analyzing the combat actions of various branches of the army and branches of the armed forces, he noted the successful interaction between them, more perfect organization of the battle by general army commanders, and increased morale of ordinary soldiers. Without emphasizing the heroism and role of the international brigades and their commanders, he noted their contribution to the overall success, thus urging everyone to follow their example. General Petrovich dwelt in more detail on the interaction of commanders and staffs, and cited as an example of its effectiveness in the destruction of the Italian division Littorio. The interaction then was expressed in the fact that successfully prepared the runways that had been thawed by rain, timely was blown up the bridge on the Tahonia River, as a result of which the whole division was, as in a trap, in a narrow deep defile, as well as timely was concentrated effective artillery fire and an infantry attack. I arrived in Madrid to dismantle the operation and prepared to report on the action of sapper units and engineering support of operations, but it was not required. General Petrovich was well aware of the actions of these units and analysed them in detail, and was pleasantly surprised, because now there was no need for my report to a group of responsible commanders and advisers, and I only had to listen to a good assessment of my activities and measures taken. The Chief Counselor said, "I would like to point out that timely assistance and valuable guidance from our advisers also contributed to the success. For example, young Captain Pavito, as an advisor to the General Army commanders, was constantly among them. In the most difficult moments of the battle, he was next to the soldiers in the trenches, helped to eliminate delays in machine guns, accurately and correctly select targets. The same can be said about our engineer Major Dunajski, who during the battle was with the soldiers and showed them how to choose positions for firing and how to entrench. General Petrovich's assessment was a high reward for us for our modest, inconspicuous, but very necessary help to our Spanish comrades. After the defeat in the Guadalajara operation, the Frankists and Italian-German interventionists could not come to their senses for a long time and were forced to abandon active combat operations. In the strategic plan, they moved to the organization of a starvation blockade of Republican Spain. They were supported by England, France, and other capitalist countries that pursued a pro-fascist policy of non-intervention. For the Republican Army came a period of relative calm, which it used for further organizational strengthening and improving the combat effectiveness of its troops. There was an opportunity to comprehensively study the most major operations carried out before, to reflect on the accumulated combat experience, more organized combat training in the units. For us advisors, this time was filled with hard work, each in his direction, to help the relevant commanders and staffs. I tried to help establish work on the organization and supply of fortification battalions, staffing them with commanders, tried to improve, if the situation allowed, on military engineering training of these units and joint efforts to introduce the engineering support of the battle in the practical activities of commanders and fighters. I had to work hard to debunk the naive and self-righteous notion that entrenching was insulting and unworthy of a brave Spanish soldier. Along with all this, I tried to use in training some new elements of the engineering equipment of positions to make trenches and passages not straight, but with a clearly defined zigzag shape, full-length open passages, trenches for soldiers and machine gunners to make under-trench shelters, the lack of which led to heavy losses from the fire of enemy aircraft, artillery and mortars. Both during the operations and after the Guadalajara battles, Major Butia, Major Echeverria and many others, whose names have not survived in my memory, proved to be good commanders. They all had a civilian specialty as engineers or civil engineering technicians. They were faithful sons of the Spanish people, fervent patriots, communists who had passed through the school of the 5th Regiment. Under their leadership, sapper battalions were strengthened and in the last battles were more and more actively and effectively included in the combat operations of the Spanish Republican Army. Between August and September 1937, several operations of local importance were carried out. Thus, the Teruel operation aimed to improve the position of the Republican troops and repel enemy strikes. During the course of these battles, fortification battalions played an increasingly active role. Gradually improved the engineering equipment of firing positions of rifle and artillery units. To fulfill these tasks, during this period I regularly visited the troops, was in the 12th Brigade of General Lukács and the 11th International Brigade, commanded by Walter. K. Swiaczewski, a Soviet Army officer, was an excellent trained and brave combat commander.
On the Teruel front, General Batov was the advisor to the front commander, and the Bulgarian Stefan Hadjikristev served as his assignee.
The advisors sent from the Soviet Army to the Spanish Republican Army were there for a short time. This was done so that as many commanders as possible took part in the battles, gained combat experience, studied the strengths and weaknesses of the enemy, as well as the features of the use of new weapons and military equipment. The time for my return to the Soviet Union was approaching. No one had warned me about this, but I realized it because many of those whom I found during my arrival in Spain had already left, and their place was taken by others. In November, the one who replaced me also arrived. The meeting took place in Madrid, at the apartment of Comrade Maximov. He then became the chief advisor and, together with Rodion Malinovsky, introduced me to Officer Nagorny, who had arrived to replace me as an advisor on engineering troops. Together with Comrade Nagorny, we worked for about 20 days while I familiarized him with the affairs, people, and introduced him to the situation. Then I set out on a return trip, and in the second half of December got off the steamer in the port of Leningrad, and from there I went to Moscow. My work in the Spanish Republican Army was positively evaluated, and I was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. A year of hard work in the Spanish Republican Army for all of us, advisors, was a very useful combat school. With a sense of high consciousness, we fulfilled our international duty, helping the Spanish people to defend freedom and independence in the fight against foreign invaders and fascist rebels Franco. As a personal great grief, we experienced later the fall of the Republic. It is known that the main cause of the fall of the Spanish Republic was the fascist intervention of Italy and Germany and the policy of non-intervention of the Western powers, which proved to be the best ally of Hitler, Mussolini and Franco. Franco and his allies had extensive agents in the rear of the Republican Army and in the government of Largo Caballero, among the Army command staff, in various government agencies, organizations and among the population. They were always accurately informed of both the condition of the army and the mood of the country. They had the opportunity to familiarize themselves in advance with the plans and forthcoming actions of the Republican Army. Taking advantage of this, the rebels also received the most active assistance from the interventionists with weapons and military equipment. In addition, the rebels were close to their territories and could undertake preemptive operations to change the situation on the fronts in their favor. The motley character of the Republican government, its petty bourgeois nature, social democratic indecision, and opportunism were carried over to varying degrees to all the headquarters and units of the Republican Army, with the exception of the International Brigades and the 5th Regiment of Madrid. All this led to the fact that the army as a whole lacked strict military discipline, lacked order and responsibility among the personnel, and above all among the commanders, did not fight for the observance of military secrecy, and did not take effective measures against the intelligence activities of the enemy. The correspondent of the newspaper Pravda on the Madrid front, Mikhail Koltsov, being a talented journalist, was also a very active fighter, had time to be on the hottest parts of the front. Together with him and his Spanish comrades, we repeatedly made our way to the front lines, to the underground galleries under the university city during the mine war and other dangerous places. As a journalist, he had access to government circles and personally to Prime Minister Largo Caballero. In his correspondences and articles, Koltsov boldly exposed the unsightly sides of the Republican government. In 1938, his book Spanish Diary was published, a testimony to the true tragedy. In the chapter February 7th, Koltsov writes the city is full to overflowing, apartments compacted, ministries are still fighting over buildings, ministers live and dine in hotels. Each is followed by a flock of journalists. In the evening in hotel restaurants, at a common coffee loudly discuss all military and government affairs. Everyone scolds Largo Caballero opponents out loud, supporters quietly. But he is feared. The old man has a stern manner, he shouts, does not allow objections, military issues he decides solely as Minister of War, all other issues solely as head of government. In the end, let him decide. But he doesn't. Papers of the most important military operational importance accumulate in piles, unexamined, unexecuted. Whatever happens, Caballero goes to bed at 9 o'clock in the evening, and no one dares to wake the old man. If even Madrid falls at midnight, the head of the government will not know about it until the morning. A deafening struggle is being waged against him, but he suppresses everyone so far by threats to quit, and by this to decapitate the Popular Front. Even the communists, who see more clearly than anyone else the ruin of his policy, even they consider his resignation premature and harmful for the time being, thinking that it will damage the external authority of the government. The old man feels this and therefore deliberately terrorizes everyone. Either he must be obeyed unconditionally, or he will abandon everything. The new offensive is prepared terribly slow. The units are not staffed, still not fully armed, although there are weapons. Caballero will not issue a single rifle without his personal visa. It seems to him that the later he issues the weapons, the better he will preserve them. In fact, the opposite is true. The soldiers are exercised on wooden sticks, and if they receive their weapons just before the battle, they will not be able to handle them, will break them, or will throw them away. Everyone in the city knows about the future offensive. The enemy knows, of course, and here they know that the enemy knows, and the enemy knows that we know it. In the coffee houses, in the headquarters, in the streetcars, they argue about whether the rebels will succeed in preempting us, or whether we will succeed in preempting the enemy. After Madrid, all this is unusual, frustrating and disturbing to listen to. In Madrid, 2 kilometers from the front, people believe in success more than here, in the rear. The main thing in the operational plan of the Republican offensive, the main thing is that the strike group of up to 15 brigades, the whole army, strikes the fascists on the left flank of our defences, from the section Marinosa San Martin de la Vega, and comes out on the first day on the Toledo highway. A supporting group strikes at Brunetti. Another group covers the main group from the south. Madrid's corps is given additional strikes, one from El Pardo Park and another from Villaverde, from Lister's former fortified positions. Madrid Corps, already shelled, tested in heavy fighting, is given a secondary role. It is not without politics. Largo Caballero and Chief of General Staff General Cabrera in their heads that they will liberate Madrid with the forces of a completely new. They themselves formed an army, to which the people of Madrid have nothing to do. With this, Caballero will wash off the stain from himself. After all, he not only abandoned in November Madrid, but also openly stated that there is no strategic sense in the untimely defence of the capital. Now he will prove himself right and act as the liberator of Madrid. Slowly, with a creak, the staff car works. Officers are travelling from Valencia to the headquarters of the Central Front, from the headquarters of the Central Front in Madrid. Crawl letters, reports, warm up on the road, outdated, cancelled. There are endless negotiations by telephone. Counterintelligence has warned many times that the Nazis are eavesdropping, that you cannot trust the telephone wires. Therefore, the chiefs talk in a terribly conspiratorial language.
Hola, Colonel. Have the birds arrived yet?
Yes, my general. They arrived at 9:30 this morning. How many birds? 14 light and 4 heavy. 2 of the heavy birds broke their landing gear on landing. Caramba! What idiot was driving them? It's already been reported to the aviation fat man, but he's not impressed. It's too small an accident for the minister. He's still going to give us 4 heavy birds. And the turtles, are they all on their way? Not all of them, my general. 2 platoons of turtles are repairing the caterpillar gears. But we'll never get started that way. This is the second time the wedding's been postponed. I swear by the Holy Communion, the Nazis will start before us. Intelligence reports that everything is ready for their wedding.
There's nothing I can do. You know, my general, what's the situation with the groom? He gets angry when we remind him.
And the groom's deputy, has he left Valencia yet? I don't suppose he will. The groom will go with the second deputy. With the beard. Ah, yes, my general. That's none of my business. I don't know about it. He won't see me. What is your report on the children's health? The children are perfectly healthy. Their temperature is rising. Mind you, I'm short 2,800 toys from the last shipment. And these, what's his name, are in short supply. I'm running out of them. Even on quiet days we're using up of the what's his name. 80,000 a day. And their birds haven't arrived. Of course they didn't. They did. 7 birds. They threw nuts. 7 nuts. No casualties. There was a casualty. 1 nut exploded right next to headquarters. Killed a man with a stick. With what, my general? With a stick, I said. I beg your pardon, my general? With a stick, I said. Don't you understand the conventional language? Well, with a stick, with a machine gun, do you understand? Understood, my general. The offensive was scheduled for January 27th, then postponed to February 1st, then to February 6th, and now it's scheduled for the 12th. In the meantime, not only reconnaissance, but the very units on the left flank of the defence are reporting rebel activity in this sector. It looks as if Franco will be preempted after all. The Communist Party rallied all the forces of the resistance around it. The international brigades were the most reliable, most capable units of the Republican Army, but they could not cover all fronts. They usually constituted the main striking force in an operation. This was the case, for example, at Guadalajara, which ensured success. Communists made great efforts to impose strict order in the army and to teach the fighters modern rules of engagement. Communist commanders were a model of performance and heroic, selfless service to their cause. The Communist Party organized in Madrid its 5th Regiment, which actually became a permanent school for training fighters, and above all commanders, for the front. The commanders who passed this school formed the main core of the command staff of units and formations. However, this was extremely insufficient. The regiment, of course, was not able to prepare personnel for the entire army in a combat situation.